By December 1944, the German army, the Wehrmacht, was fighting two wars. The first was the war of bullets and bombs, the war against the encroaching Allies squeezing the Third Reich from the east and the west. But the second war was more immediate, more personal, and far more difficult to win. It was the war against the empty stomach. For the average German Lanzer, shivering in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, the glorious conquest of Europe had reduced itself to a singular, gnawing obsession: calories. The logistical spine of the German military had been snapped. The rail lines were pulverized by Allied bombers. The fuel depots were dry. The trucks were broken down on the side of the road, engines seized for lack of oil. The once mighty mechanized army was now relying on horse-drawn carts to bring up moldy bread and watered-down turnip soup to the front lines. Hunger does strange things to a soldier's mind. It strips away ideology. It strips away patriotism. When you haven't eaten a real meal in 3 weeks, you don't care about the Führer or the fatherland. You care about the rumor that the unit next door found a crate of potatoes. You care about the fact that your boots are leaking and your toes are turning black. And most of all, you look across the misty strip of no man's land at the enemy, and you wonder how they are surviving. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, tried to fill this void with lies. They told the German troops that the Americans were suffering just as badly. They claimed that the U-boat wolf packs had severed the Atlantic supply lines, that the people of New York and Chicago were rioting over bread shortages, and that the American soldiers on the front line were freezing, starving conscripts who were on the verge of mutiny. The German commanders told their men that the American equipment was inferior, that their tanks were made of tin, and that their morale was brittle.
They painted a picture of two exhausted boxers leaning against each other, waiting for the other to fall. But every now and then, the wind would blow from the west, and on that wind, carrying through the pine trees of the Belgian border, came a smell that contradicted every lie the German soldiers had been told. It wasn't the smell of cordite or rotting flesh. It was the smell of frying bacon. It was the scent of brewing coffee, real coffee, not the roasted acorn substitute the Germans were drinking. It was the smell of fresh white bread. To a starving man, these smells were more devastating than a mortar barrage. They were the olfactory proof that the enemy wasn't just surviving, they were thriving. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to break the Allied line, is often remembered for the tank battles and the heroism of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. But for the logistical planners, it was a collision of two different centuries. The Germans launched the attack with the finest tanks in the world, the Tiger IIs and Panthers, but they supported them with a logistics system that belonged in the Napoleonic Wars. Behind the panzer divisions trailed thousands of horses pulling wagons. The German soldiers were ordered to capture Allied fuel dumps because they only had enough gas to get halfway to Antwerp. They were ordered to scavenge food from captured American rations because their own supply trucks couldn't get through the snow. On the other side of the line sat the United States Army Services of Supply. This was a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Americans didn't just bring soldiers to Europe, they brought America to Europe. They had built a steel bridge across the Atlantic, a conveyor belt of Liberty ships that never stopped. For every American soldier on the trigger of a rifle, there were 10 men behind him driving trucks, baking bread, fixing engines, and freezing ice cream. Yes, ice cream. The U.S. Navy had actually commissioned a concrete barge in the Pacific, dedicated solely to producing ice cream for the troops. And while the setup in Europe wasn't quite that extravagant, the commitment to comfort was the same. The American philosophy of war was industrial. If a soldier is miserable, he fights poorly. If he is well-fed, warm, and feels supported, he fights harder. So the Quartermaster Corps didn't just ship bullets. They shipped millions of turkeys for Thanksgiving. They shipped fresh eggs. They shipped chewing gum, razor blades, dry socks, and paperback books. To the German soldier, peering through his binoculars from a frozen foxhole, the sight of the American rear echelon was baffling. He saw traffic jams. Not traffic jams of refugees, but traffic jams of GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, bumper to bumper, stretching for miles. This was the Red Ball Express, a continuous loop of trucks running supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front. The Germans were rationing artillery shells, firing only a few rounds a day. The Americans were firing millions of shells, creating mountains of brass casings that they didn't even bother to pick up. But the breaking point, the moment that truly destroyed the German will to fight, wasn't the quantity of the ammunition. It was the temperature of the food. There is a famous anecdote from the North African campaign that set the precedent for what would happen in the Ardennes. A German unit had captured a British armored vehicle. Inside, they found a fresh chocolate cake that had been mailed from Boston to a soldier on the front lines. The cake was still moist. The German commander, upon seeing the cake, reportedly said, "We have lost. We cannot defeat a country that can ship a fresh cake across an ocean to a private in the desert." Now multiply that cake by 1,000,000. In the winter of 1944, the American Army introduced the kitchen truck. These were mobile galleys that moved with the units. They were equipped with gasoline-fired field ranges. The cooks would wake up at 3 a.m., hours before the infantry, to start baking. They made pancakes. They scrambled powdered eggs. They fried Spam. And crucially, they had Marmite cans, insulated thermal containers that could keep food hot for hours. The system worked like this. The cooks would prepare a hot meal in the rear. They would load the steaming food into these thermal containers. Then, jeeps or trucks would drive these containers right up to the foxholes. An American GI, sitting in a muddy hole in the middle of a war zone, could open a container and scoop out hot stew, hot coffee, and warm bread. Compare this to the German reality. The Feldküche, the German field kitchen, nicknamed the goulash cannon, was a horse-drawn stove. It was slow. It was vulnerable to air attack. Because the Allies had total air superiority, the German kitchens couldn't move during the day. They had to cook miles behind the lines at night and then bring the food forward in cold metal canisters carried by men on foot. By the time the food reached the German frontline soldier, it was a cold, congealed, greasy sludge. And that was on a good day. On a bad day, the runners were killed by artillery, and the food never came. So, when the German offensive in the Ardennes began and the Wehrmacht overran the forward American positions, the German soldiers stopped fighting. They didn't stop because they were out of ammo, though they often were. They stopped because they found the American dugouts. Imagine a squad of starving Volksgrenadiers, men who had been eating sawdust bread and raw turnips for weeks. They storm an American position. The Americans have retreated. The Germans enter the dugout cautiously, weapons raised. They expect to find maps, maybe some grenades. Instead, they find a wonderland. They find boxes of K-rations that include chocolate bars, instant coffee, and fruit bars.
They find cartons of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, and Chesterfields that aren't made of dried leaves and weeds. But then, they find the Marmite cans. One of the soldiers pries off the lid. Steam rises into the freezing air. The smell of beef and vegetable stew hits them. It's still hot. This is a psychological nuclear bomb. It tells the German soldier two things instantly. First, the enemy is so rich that he can abandon hot food and not care. Second, and more importantly, the enemy's supply lines are so fast, so efficient, and so unbroken that they can deliver a hot meal to the very tip of the spear, mere minutes before an attack. There are accounts from American soldiers who retook these positions days later. They found the German dead not in firing positions, but huddled around the food supplies, mouths stuffed with American chocolate, pockets lined with American cigarettes. They had prioritized eating over defending themselves. The discipline of the Wehrmacht, forged in centuries of Prussian tradition, had been shattered by the caloric dominance of the U.S. Army. As the Battle of the Bulge dragged on and the German offensive stalled, the surrender by logistics phenomenon began to accelerate. German officers tried to maintain order. They threatened to shoot deserters. They screamed about duty and honor. But you cannot argue with a man who is watching the enemy eat a turkey dinner while you gnaw on the leather strap of your equipment harness. The American psychological warfare units, the PSYOPs teams, knew this. They began to weaponize the food. They didn't just drop leaflets telling the Germans to give up. They dropped menus. They broadcast radio messages across the lines describing the dinner menu for the American troops that night. Tonight, Company B is having roast chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy, followed by peach cobbler. What are you having, Hans? Frozen horse? It was cruel, but effective. The trickle of deserters turned into a flood.
And when these German soldiers crossed the lines, hands high in the air, shouting, "Kamerad!" they didn't ask for mercy. They didn't ask for a lawyer. They asked almost universally for the same thing. When do we eat? But the true scale of this logistical victory was best illustrated by a specific event in early 1945, near the Remagen bridgehead. A massive group of German soldiers was holed up in a forest, surrounded but heavily armed. They had tanks, they had anti-tank weapons, and they had the high ground. The American commander in the sector didn't want to waste lives digging them out. He knew they were starving. So instead of sending in the bombers, he decided to send a message. He ordered his supply trucks to drive along the road parallel to the German positions, in full view, but just out of effective range. He ordered the canvas covers taken off the back of the trucks. The German soldiers watched. They saw truck after truck rolling by. One was stacked high with crates of oranges, bright orange spheres that stood out against the gray winter landscape. Another was loaded with fresh white bread. Another with crates of Coca-Cola. It was a parade of abundance. It was a rolling display of infinite resources. The German commander in the forest looked at his men. He looked at the trucks. He realized that even if he killed every American soldier facing him, there were 10,000 more trucks behind them, filled with more men and more food. He realized that he wasn't fighting an army. He was fighting an economy. He realized that the blockade was a lie. The propaganda was a lie, and the hope of victory was a delusion. He didn't order a charge. He didn't order a last stand. He ordered his men to stack their rifles. He walked down the hill, approached the American lines, and surrendered his entire regiment. When asked by the American interrogation officer why he had given up such a strong position without firing a shot, the German officer simply pointed to the road where the trucks were still rolling. "We could fight your tanks," he said. "We could fight your infantry, but we cannot fight your bakery." The surrender of that regiment near Remagen was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a systemic collapse that was rippling through the entire Western Front. As the American armies pushed deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, the Bakery War entered its final, undeniable phase. The German soldier, now fighting on his own soil, defending his own home, should have been more fanatical than ever. The Nazi leadership screamed that this was the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, where every German must fight to the last bullet. But the physical reality of the American supply lines made these speeches sound like madness. When a German soldier surrendered and was marched to the rear, he entered a world that defied his comprehension. This journey, from the front line to the holding cages, was known as the Golden Mile. It was a journey through the heart of the American logistical beast. As the prisoners trudged west along the muddy roads, they walked past the things that had defeated them. They didn't just pass tanks and artillery. They passed mountains of crates. In the open fields of France and Belgium, the Americans had established supply dumps that covered hundreds of acres. There were pyramids of jerry cans filled with gasoline, stacked 20 feet high and stretching for a quarter of a mile. There were fields filled with spare tires, thousands of them, smelling of fresh rubber. There were entire parking lots filled with replacement engines, transmissions, and axles, just sitting there, waiting for a truck to break down. To a German mechanic who had spent the last year trying to fix a Tiger tank with baling wire and stolen farm parts, this wastefulness was almost offensive. It was obscene. The Americans treated machinery as disposable. If a Jeep broke an axle, they didn't spend 3 days machining a new part. They just pushed the Jeep into a ditch and grabbed a new one from the depot. The German prisoners stared at this industrial excess with open mouths. They realized that they had been fighting a war of artisans against a war of mass production. They had been crafting battles like handmade watches, while the Americans were churning out victory like Ford Model Ts. And then there were the Red Ball Express drivers. The German prisoners, many of whom had never seen a black person before, were often shocked to see who was driving this endless river of trucks. The U.S. Army was segregated in World War II, and the vast majority of the truck drivers in the Quartermaster Corps were African American. These men drove the Red Ball Express, a dedicated highway loop from Normandy to the front where civilian traffic was banned and trucks ran 24 hours a day, regardless of weather or fatigue. These drivers were the lifeblood of the offensive. They stripped the governors off their engines to drive faster. They sandbagged the floors of their cabs to survive landmines. And they carried the very food that broke the Wehrmacht's will. The German prisoners watched these black drivers rolling by, smoking cigarettes, one arm hanging out the window, driving vehicles loaded with fresh oranges and crates of Hershey bars. It dismantled another layer of Nazi propaganda, the lie of the master race. Here were the men the Nazis considered inferior, and yet they were the ones delivering the knockout blow, driving the machines that the master race could neither fuel nor stop. As the war entered the Ruhr pocket, the industrial heartland of Germany, the mass surrenders reached biblical proportions. In April 1945, over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr. It was the largest capitulation in German history. But what makes this event unique is how they surrendered. They didn't march out in formation. They simply dissolved. American units reported driving into German towns and finding the enemy soldiers sitting on the curbs, weapons stacked neatly in piles, waiting for the trucks. They weren't waiting for transport to prison. They were waiting for the chow line. In one town, an American mess sergeant set up his field kitchen in the town square to feed his own company. Within minutes, hundreds of German soldiers emerged from basements and forests, mess kits in hand, forming a polite, orderly line behind the GIs. They didn't shoot. They didn't try to escape. They just wanted to know if there was enough stew for them. The American sergeant, baffled but pragmatic, radioed his commander. "Sir, I have 200 krauts here. They're hungry. Should I feed them?" The commander's reply was the ultimate statement of American logistical dominance. "Feed them. We've got plenty." This abundance had a strange, corrupting effect on the battlefield itself. The American ration, the K ration or C ration, became the currency of the front. The chocolate bars, the instant coffee, and the cigarettes became more valuable than Reichsmarks or gold.
American soldiers realized that they could often bypass a fight simply by offering a trade. There are documented accounts of American patrols encountering German patrols in the woods during the chaotic final weeks. Instead of opening fire, a strange negotiation would take place. An American GI would toss a pack of cigarettes or a chocolate bar across the gap. The hungry Germans would scramble for it. The tension would break. The Germans would trade their iron crosses, their Lugers, even their unit flags, for a box of de-rationed chocolate bars. It was the ultimate humiliation for the Wehrmacht. Their symbols of valor were being traded for calories. But the most potent weapon in the American culinary arsenal was not the chocolate. It was the turkey. The story of the Turkey Run is one of the most incredible logistical feats of military history.
Yet it is rarely discussed. In November 1944, just before the Battle of the Bulge, and again at Christmas, the U.S. High Command decided that every American soldier in the European theater of operations, from the generals in Paris to the riflemen in the Hurtgen Forest, would receive a traditional hot turkey dinner with all the trimmings. This required shipping thousands of tons of frozen turkey across the U-boat-infested Atlantic. It required a refrigerated supply chain that extended into the combat zone. It required thousands of cooks working around the clock. And they did it. On Christmas Day, 1944, while the German army was eating horsemeat soup and freezing in their thin greatcoats, the American lines smelled of roasting bird and cranberry sauce. The scent drifted across the lines. It was a psychological masterstroke. German soldiers wrote in their diaries about the smell. It drove them mad. It wasn't just that the Americans were eating well. It was the insult of it. It was the fact that the Americans treated the war so casually that they paused the apocalypse to roast a bird. A captured German lieutenant, interrogated after the Battle of the Bulge, summed it up perfectly. He was asked what he thought of the American fighting man. He replied, "Your soldiers are undisciplined. They are loud. They are disrespectful to their officers. But you are the only army in history that fights a war with a refrigerator. And that is why you beat us." This refrigerator war culminated in the occupation of Germany. When the shooting finally stopped in May 1945, the role of the U.S. supply lines shifted instantly from destruction to salvation. Germany was starving. The infrastructure was gone. The people were living in cellars, surviving on roughly 800 calories a day. The same trucks that had brought the ammunition to kill the Wehrmacht now brought the flour to feed the population. The Red Ball Express trucks were repainted and repurposed to haul grain. The American field kitchens were set up in the ruins of Berlin and Munich, feeding the very civilians who had been building V-2 rockets months earlier. This transition cemented the victory in a way that military occupation never could. If the Americans had come only as conquerors, the German resistance might have continued underground, fueled by resentment and hunger, the werewolf guerrilla movement that the Allies feared. But it is very hard to maintain a guerrilla war against the people who are baking your bread. The German people, like their soldiers, were conquered by the supply line. They saw the GIs handing out chocolate to children. They saw the care packages arriving from the US, boxes filled with coffee, sugar, and milk. They realized that the American system, for all its flaws, provided a life of abundance that Nazism had promised but failed to deliver. The ideology of Hitler was defeated not just by the tank, but by the grocery store. In the final analysis, the image of World War II is often one of kinetic violence. The paratrooper jumping into darkness, the Marine storming the beach, the pilot diving on a target. These are the images of courage. But the image that truly explains the Allied victory is far more mundane. It is the image of a truck, a simple, ugly, olive drab GMC truck, loaded with crates of Spam and socks, driving through the mud of France and the pouring rain. That truck was the irresistible force. It was the physical manifestation of an economy that could afford to be wasteful in a world of scarcity.
The German soldiers who surrendered en masse didn't do so because they were cowards. They surrendered because they were professionals. They looked at the math. They looked at their own empty ammo pouches. And then they looked at the American skyline of boxes and crates. They realized that bravery has a shelf life, but logistics is eternal. They surrendered to the hot meal because, in the end, the hot meal was the ultimate proof of power.
The Wehrmacht expected to fight a war of warriors. Instead, they fought a war of warehouse managers, and the warehouse managers kicked their ass.